Monday through, I believe it's Monday through Saturday, it's 9:30 to 5.
Yep.
And Sunday, we're open 1 to 5. And just an update, in the new year, we'll be picking up prehistoric painting nights again. We had one in November, and that was a test run. So starting in January, we'll have a new event with a new animal. So feel free to stop in and see if you can sign up for it. We'll have a limited number of spots again. So today, we're going to be covering kind of a pretty famous dinosaur nowadays, but not as famous as it could have been. And that is the Spinosaurs. So right here we have Spinosaurus. So we're going to go over what they did ecologically, what they ate, and this is a dinosaur we're going to go over a little bit about why it probably looks different than it did in your childhood. And also a little bit into how it was discovered and the person who discovered it, because he's kind of an interesting person. So Spinosaurs are theropod dinosaurs, the same family of dinosaurs that you get most of the carnivorous dinosaurs in. They're actually carnosaurs, not coelurosaurs like the dromaeosaurs. So these dinosaurs were a little bit different. Their hands had a different structure, and we're going to go over that when we go into a different family of dinosaurs. But the other thing is carnosaurs were less frequently feathered, which is a big difference between them and coelurosaurs. And there were only about 6 or 7 different species of Spinosaur. And kind of counterintuitively, only 2 or 3 of them definitively had these scales, these spines on their back. Most of them didn't. And they weren't actually that numerous, and also they didn't last for that long. They only lasted from the early to the mid-Cretaceous. They didn't even get to 65 million years ago. So the largest Spinosaur is Spinosaurus. Spinosaurus is an absolutely massive animal. It's potentially the largest terrestrial predator to ever live, at approximately 50 feet and over 7 tons, which is truly massive. It's sometimes hard to conceive of animals that size in your imagination. The smallest, though, was only about 20 feet long and only weighed about 1 ton. And that would have been a smaller, earlier relative. So these animals were bipedal to a degree, but also likely could walk around on all fours if they ever had to. They had relatively short back legs compared to other theropod dinosaurs, so they probably weren't that fast. But they didn't really need to be to catch their prey, because they were piscivorous, which is a specialized type of carnivore that specialized in eating fish. So these guys didn't have to run after their prey. They kind of were initially thought to have eaten more like grizzly bears going after salmon, or standing or wading into the water or leaning over it to grab their prey with their mouths, which is why their mouths had a relatively unique, more crocodilian shape to them. And we still don't really know what the sail is for, because not all of them possess the sail. We're not sure if it was for any sort of survival purpose or a display purpose, perhaps. We're not even sure if it was a sail or a hump on their back that was supported by these spines. And it's part of paleontology, is sometimes these animals' anatomies, they come from a different time in Earth's history and different ecosystems that we don't always have the full picture of. So sometimes there are little bits like this that leave a bit of a mystery. So these animals were also not really found as widely distributed as our previous 2 groups of dinosaurs we looked over, the dromaeosaurs and the ankylosaurs, who were relatively widely distributed. Dinosaurs were only found in Europe, South America, a little bit of Asia, and Africa. And kind of a cool thing about them is they're the first known semi-aquatic dinosaurs. While there are more that have been discovered recently, these were the first ones where we actually had the definitive evidence. Not only were they fish eaters, but also they had the ability to swim somewhat effectively. And also, they're one of the few dinosaurs nowadays that we have super definitive evidence of total lack of feathers. For a semi-aquatic animal, the way that they lived, the feathers happen to be a disadvantage. So, kind of a fun thing about Spinosaurus, it was discovered by a guy named Ernst Stromer, who was a German paleontologist in the early 1900s. And he initially found actually a decent amount of the skeleton. He found a lot of the front of the jaw, a lot of the sail, the spines that supported it. a few neck vertebrae, and some ribs. And he was able to see that it was already kind of an unusual animal. And he was able to estimate size using enough, given that he had enough of the skeleton as well, he had some tail vertebrae. He realized it was an exceptionally large animal, and in fact was at the time the largest carnivorous dinosaur discovered. This is in a time before animals like Tyrannosaurus were widely known or definitively described. And he was going to announce this at a get-together of paleontologists. But unfortunately, when he was going to do that, World War II was going. And while he had found these bones a few decades earlier, he had only had the time to really do a thorough examination around the time of World War II. And unfortunately, the bones that he had discovered were destroyed in an air raid by the Allies. And he did not feel confident in presenting only his sketches of these bones. So instead, a dinosaur that was announced around the same time, something you're actually more familiar with, was Tyrannosaurus rex. Another quite large carnivorous dinosaur measuring almost 40 feet long in North America. And that dinosaur became sort of a pop culture obsession. But were it not for a few bits of other history happening, this dinosaur might be one of the most famous dinosaurs in the world. Might have been the most famous. But Ernst Stromer dealt with a few career difficulties, some would say. He lived at a time some might recognize overlapping with World War II. And Ernst Stromer was a staunch anti-Nazi. He was very against that party, and he was quite well off. He was born in a very high-class family, so he was not able to publicly be arrested or executed. But they did their best to make his life very difficult. All three of his sons were conscripted into the Eastern Front of World War II fighting Russia, and 2 of them were killed, 1 of them went missing, only to come back years later after being released from Russian captivity. And also his wife died during this time, and his career was made difficult because very few of the scientists in Germany would work with the man because he was not a Nazi. And it made his career and life one marked by tragedy because he lost not only his career, his family, but also some of his greatest discoveries and contributions to his field. And it shows how science is not unaffected or separate from the culture and time that it takes place. But it's good to sometimes acknowledge the history behind some of these discoveries because it does, again, bring it a little bit more into real life. So back on these animals. So another thing you might have noticed is Spinosaurus has not always looked this weird crocodilian bird type look, which we actually have a model here, 3D printed here at the Science Center. So this is a very up-to-date model of Spinosaurus. The back legs, very short, but long enough to allow bipedalism. The tail has this sort of fin, and the sail is not an even rounded shape. And it has this large crocodilian-like head. So for a long time, people tended to just put a very stereotypical sort of tyrannosaur-looking head on Spinosaurus, give it the normal long back legs, and kind of round the sail off. Now, the reason oftentimes these depictions change is because we'll often find more fossils of the animal. And that is something that happened with Spinosaurus in the past 5 years. There was actually a series of discoveries of skeletal parts of this that made the picture of this animal get a lot clearer. So the first thing is someone found a better preserved set of back legs, which showed that how we were filling in some of the blanks was incorrect. This animal didn't look as much like some of the smaller Spinosaurs who did have longer back legs. It had a lot smaller back legs that kept it a little bit closer to the ground. The other thing was we had more of the tail vertebrae and more of the spine vertebrae found, which showed the uneven pattern. And we found more of the upper jaw, the upper skull, which was able to show us it was long and crocodilian-like. It had this very weird kind of hook, which was probably useful for catching fish. And the other thing was just more modern research methods were able to be used and give us a clear picture of the animal. We have better ways of estimating size, estimating what is actually missing on these animals. We found more not just of Spinosaurus, but of other Spinosaurs like Baryonyx, Suchomimus, Irritator, and others. And Spinosaurus is still not without controversy. There are a few paleontologists who like to attribute some Spinosaurus fossils to a species of dinosaur that's really generally disregarded as being valid, called Sigilmassosaurus. There's a few paleontologists who've kind of hinged their career on this dinosaur being real. It lived in the same place, which was the northern part of Africa, and pretty much if you put down any Sigilmassosaurus bones in front of a paleontologist, most of them will agree it's a Spinosaurus. And it does show a lot of paleontology is subjective still. We are working with the remains of these animals, not the animals themselves. But depictions constantly change with new evidence. When we get new information, we typically need to adjust what we were thinking before. As we went over with the dromaeosaurs, that whole group of dinosaurs did show us that dinosaurs were not just large, slow animals. They were actually, potentially, some of them small and nimble. Some of them large and nimble, actually. But again, evidence always will change the picture a little bit. And that's just how it goes. So we're going to go over a few of the other things. So the term semi-aquatic means it's a land-living animal that spends a decent chunk of its time in the water, or hunts near or in the water, if it's a carnivore. And the reason we know Spinosaurus was we do actually have a few foot track preservations as well that do show that this animal is correctly to be reconstructed with webbed feet. So it was swimming in a part of its life. The other thing is piscivory is eating fish. It's specializing in eating fish. And this animal has a lot of adaptations for that. It has very crocodile-like teeth. The reason we have two crocodilian specimens out here today, crocodiles have very conical teeth. There's not a big cutting edge on them because their teeth are meant for grabbing their prey and holding it rather than cutting up and processing that food because they tend to swallow their prey whole. So Spinosaurus would have been hunting in a very similar method where it would have been grabbing and holding its prey. They wanted to get that fish out of the water, and then they would probably swallow it whole. So these animals were, again, as I said, about 50 feet and over 7 tons. They were not eating insubstantial fish. At the time where these animals lived, the Sahara Desert was actually quite lush and was full of tributaries and waterways. And probably why this animal specialized in fish was to avoid competition with some of the larger carnivores of its day, like Carcharodontosaurus, which was probably hunting terrestrial prey. If you want to avoid competing with another large predator, you find something different to do. It's called niche partitioning. So this animal decided, well, I'm going to eat fish. And it became very good. Now these fish were not, something like this big. These were fish that were roughly the size of a person or bigger, over 6 feet long. So this animal was quite formidable. And in fact, you'll still find modern relatives of the fish it was eating around today, these sawtooth fish. They're a relative of the shark, and they have a large sort of nose that extends out with teeth sticking out the side. So these guys were already eating pretty serious prey. And again, going back on the sail, it's still kind of a mystery. A lot of people think it may have been a display thing for mating. It might have been something to scare off predators, to make the animal look bigger than it was. And it could have been for regulating body temperature. Being able to face that into the sun and absorb heat would have been an advantage for an aquatic animal. It could have been used to, like a marlin or a swordfish fin, kind of corral prey in the water. There's a ton of potential uses, but because we're not working with the full animal, we have no way to actually observe this animal doing any of these things, they still sit in the realm of speculation. And that is one of the big rough parts of paleontology, is a lot of times the best you have is a decently well-supported hypothesis, but you can never always get the evidence for it. And again, due to the fact that a lot of them, like Baryonyx, totally lacked the sail, we're reasonably sure it probably wasn't due to something for key survival aspects. Like, these animals do not need the sail to live, necessarily. Yeah, these are one of my favorite dinosaurs just because of how much, not only they show how scientists have to adjust hypotheses as we get more information, but just how much the field of paleontology can change and how weird dinosaurs can get. Spinosaurs, so they mean spined lizard. They're kind of a big, weird crocodile bird when you think about it. And it shows that past ecosystems on Earth were very much a different place. It was a different world. Anyone have any questions about anything or any thoughts about this animal?
Know what color they were?
This is one that we don't have a good idea of what color it was. I know for the past couple of dinosaurs we've gone over, there's at least one species where we can go over and be like, so we're reasonably sure what color it was. Unfortunately, the preserved members of Spinosauridae that we did find skin impressions of were not preserved in especially fine sediments. So while the scale impressions were preserved, the microscopic melanocyte preservation was not great. So the best idea most people tend to default with Spinosaurus is they tend to color it like a big crocodile, which I can't say is wrong. It seems quite reasonable. Oftentimes you'll see some people countershade the animal, sort of similar to this painted model where the bottom is a lighter color than the top. And that's a very frequent trait of aquatic and semi-aquatic animals. Any other questions about this or thoughts on it? Okay. Well, in that case, have a great day, and I really do recommend looking up Ernst Stromer's life. It's wild, and the man deserves a lot more